The diffusion of Zionism in the West, its subsequent replenishment by the West, was spearheaded obviously enough by the Jewish communities in the West. To oppose such an idea in the West was immediately to align oneself with anti-Semitism. To support it, on the other hand, was to do a number of far more interesting and acceptable things than merely displace or ignore a basically uninteresting bunch of resident natives. Moreover, the idea of a Jewish state in, or a Jewish movement for Palestine, acquired a remarkable aura of moral prestige, the more so since the advent of fascism in Europe. Here was a people identified since ancient times with the land of Israel, identified also with a prodigious history of suffering, moral and intellectual grandeur, and above all, with dispersion. Palestine was the specific, and it seemed most liberal of all the answers to their needs. To oppose this plan was to find oneself with nowhere in the West to stand. This is still more or less true today. Zionism has always sought specific answers: immigration, hospitals, and later, arms for its defense, money. These answers attract support, since their negation seems principally to be only a negation, and an abstract and general one to boot. Anyone feeling doubts now and then about Zionist conquests in Palestine would inevitably have to face up to the fact that what he supported as a result was a general Arab and Islamic bloc. And this bloc, both in its amorphousness and dark abstraction, made more elegant and attractive the picture of a handful of European Jews hewing a civilization of sweetness and light out of the black Islamic sea. The Zionists occupied a place that made it possible to interpret Palestine and its realities to the West in terms that the West could understand and easily accept. Conversely, the refusal to accept the Zionist argument left anyone in the West with the poorest of alternatives, being simply negative, anti-Semitic, or an apologist for Islam and the Arabs. In any of these cases, the alternative to Zionism is too general or too outrageous. By way of contrast, Zionism offered the neatness of a specific solution or answer to a specific problem. After all, who could say what the Arabs or Islam wanted, were about, were for? Even the putting of such a question made it possible then and now, alas, to argue that the Arabs were a whole mass of generally unpleasant things, which, when they were presented at all, made for a chilling and frightening reception. The fact is that Arabs were always being represented, never able to speak for themselves. This, plus, paradoxically, their more and more evident political visibility, is why they have been so overwhelmingly refused a decent place in actuality, even when they sit on the land. So far as the Arab was concerned, he was not part of this community. To a very great extent, this community depends heavily on a remarkable tradition in the West of enmity toward Islam in particular and the Orient in general. The Arabs and Islam represent viciousness, venality, degenerate vice, lechery, and stupidity in popular and scholarly discourse. On this collective representation of the Arabs and Islam, Zionism, like its Western ideological parents, drew. It is a perfect instance of how propaganda, politicized scholarship, and ideological information have power, implement policy, and at the same time can appear to be objective truth. The Zionists took it upon themselves as a partially Eastern people who had emancipated themselves from the worst Eastern excesses to explain the Oriental Arabs to the West, to assume responsibility for expressing what the Arabs were really like and about, never to let the Arabs appear equally with them as existing in Palestine. This method allowed Zionism always to seem both involved in and superior to the native realities of Middle Eastern existence. Zionism's conflict with the Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere in the region was seen as extending, perpetuating, even enhancing, to the advantage of the West, the age-old conflict between the West and the Orient, whose main surrogate was Islam. This was not only a colonial matter, but a civilizational one as well. It was perfectly apparent to Western supporters of Zionism like Balfour that the colonization of Palestine was to be made a goal for the Western powers from the very beginning of Zionist planning. Herzl used the idea, Weizmann used it, every leading Israeli since has used it. Israel was a device for holding Islam and later the Soviet Union or communism at bay. Zionism and Israel were associated with liberalism, with freedom and democracy, with knowledge and light, with what we understand and fight for. By contrast, Zionism's enemies were simply a 20th century version of the alien spirit of Oriental despotism, sensuality, ignorance, and similar forms of backwardness. If they didn't understand the glorious enterprise that was Zionism, it was because they were hopelessly out of touch with our values.